Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this Savvy Investor webinar. The topic of today's webinar is Advance Your Net Zero Strategy. And my name is Kira Gippert. I'm a climate change specialist consultant based in Zurich, where MSCI's Climate Risk Center is located, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. I would like to kick it off and welcome our speakers today. I'm very thrilled to have a powerful trio of colleagues from across the MSCI firm with me on the webinar today. I would like to welcome Christine Chardonnay, our Global Head of ESG Index Product, Jackie Deichmann. She's an Executive Director on the ESG Client Coverage Team focused on Canadian asset owners and managers, and Anja Lutzeweit, a climate change specialist consultant herself, and she heads our Europe-based climate specialists. Together, we will be looking at different angles, how investors can further advance their net zero strategies, first focusing on the index approach, second on investor engagement, and third on net zero portfolio optimization strategies. So net zero certainly is a buzzword around the world right now and at the center of attention of governments, corporates, but of course also investors. But the meaning and magnitude behind this word or term net zero is indisputable because transitioning to net zero economies is a central solution to mitigate climate change and to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees or ideally 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. So in the lead up to the climate talks of COP26 happening later this year in Glasgow, countries have begun revising their national climate action plans, known as their nationally determined contributions or short NDCs. So earlier last week, for example, we saw the European Council adopt a climate change law that legally obliges its 27 member nations to arrive at net zero emissions economy by 2050. But it's not only governments taking climate action, also more than 4,500 non-state actors or economic players have committed to halving emissions by 2030. And we've seen net zero industry alliances forming around the world, especially also in the financial industry. In fact, the investment industry is said to have reached a tipping point with almost half the world's assets under management now pledged to meet climate change targets. But the urgency of the matter is undeniable. And when we're looking at the current policies in place, we actually fall short of meeting the Paris Agreement. And we're currently on a trajectory towards a 3-degree world. This you can see on the left-hand slide at the temperature gauge that we're showing. And it also shows the progress gap of about 2 degrees to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And also this progress gap corresponds to a varying range of the level of impact this will have on our planet, as you can see in the middle of this slide. The physical impact of climate change, such as, for example, the rise in sea levels, will differ significantly depending on what global warming trajectory we will be on. And thus the level of acute and chronic physical risks that we will be experiencing will also vary depending on the temperature alignment that we're on. So on the right-hand side, we are showing the corresponding investor challenge. Because, for example, targeting in a world or targeting an investment universe in which all companies would be aligned with a 1.5 degree trajectory, which you can see at the bottom right, would actually mean that the universe as it stands today, which is more aligned with a 3-degree global warming trajectory, would be reduced to only 10% of that original universe. This also shows very well that net zero should be understood as a journey, because as the economy stands today, companies are not yet fully aligned with a net zero target or a 1.5 degree trajectory. And thus it is crucial to, for example, use investor engagement to make sure these targets set companies for themselves and they get on the right emissions reduction trajectory. The capital markets can play a significant role in this net zero journey. So for example, asset owners can reallocate capital towards low carbon solutions, and asset managers can then effectively channel these funds on behalf of asset owners, so that we can ensure that our economy is slowly transitioning towards low carbon solutions. So the central question is, of course, given the limited universe of aligned companies we have today, how can you build a portfolio that is aligned with a net zero strategy and that ensures the underlying constituents are well positioned as the world is looking to get to net zero? And with that, I will now hand it over to my colleagues so that we can take a closer look at key strategic actions that one can consider for a net zero strategy. And first, I would like to hand it over to Christine, who will walk us through the objectives of the Paris-aligned indexes and some very great use case examples showing how organizations have adopted these indexes for implementing their own net zero strategies.
Thank you very much, Kira. So indeed, these times are critical for climate action. And this year in particular, as we head towards the UN Climate Change Conference in November. So investors and governments explore how to transition to a climate neutral world. And there are a number of global investor-led initiatives aimed at driving change through the investment process. These initiatives include the UN Environment Programme-led net zero alliances across asset owners, banks, asset managers, and insurance. There's also the IGCC, the Institutional Investor Group on climate change. The Net Zero Alliance, for example, the members of the alliance have committed to transitioning their investment portfolios to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, which is consistent with a maximum temperature rise of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So measuring and managing climate risk has become a top priority, as well as building climate resilient portfolios. Asset owners around the world have begun to use climate indices or climate index overlays to do that. They typically choose the approach that best meets their investment constraints, as well as their climate objectives and beliefs. And we're seeing that trend accelerating. In fact, we're starting to see climate indices being used by various types of investors in a variety of use cases, and I wanted to illustrate that with a few examples today. So the first example is that of an insurance company who previously had integrated ESG consideration in their internally managed portfolios, and as a climate action signatory, then decided to have dedicated climate portfolios. And they decided to implement that through a newly launched passive fund, which they seeded. And that new fund will then make it easier for other smaller investors to tag along and invest in that climate strategy. The second example is index fund managers who have been running a range of funds using mostly market cap indices historically. And today we're seeing a number of them expand their range with climate funds, but also convert existing funds to climate indices to meet investor demand for climate. Active managers have often preferred to use market cap indices as benchmark for their ESG or climate strategies, but what we're starting to see is that active climate strategies need to be transparent in terms of the carbon intensity or temperature alignment of the fund. And so active managers have, for some of them, adopted the climate index to supplement their main market cap benchmark, and in order to measure the carbon profile of the strategy against that of an official climate index. And the last example relates to asset owners who very often have bespoke strategies and wish to preserve those strategies, investment strategies, as much as possible, and therefore they will determine how to best overlay climate, including climate Paris aligned elements on top of their existing investment strategy. So we're doing a lot of work with those investors to help them integrate climate in a way that best meets their needs. Also, a few words on engagement, as engaging is a key element of the fight against climate change. Engaging with the world's largest corporate greenhouse gas emitters, so they take the necessary action on climate change. Climate indices can be used to support such engagement strategies. Investors may decide to engage with the climate laggards of the index, or they may just rely on the index methodology and reweighting mechanism to basically achieve their objectives of rewarding the best companies and penalizing the least good companies in terms of climate. Kira referred to one of MSCI's newest climate indices, the MSCI Paris Aligned Climate Index. So just a few words on that index. The first thing is that it leverages MSCI climate analytics framework, which my colleague Anya will discuss a bit later. The index tackles the 4 dimensions of climate risk and opportunities, so transition risk, green opportunities, physical risk, as well as the 1.5 degree alignment. And in the case of the Climate Paris Aligned Index, the temperature alignment is driven by the annual decarbonization of the index at a rate of 10%. This Climate Paris Aligned Index is often used by clients as such, but it also serves as a framework and starting point for many client conversations. So investors may decide to adjust this index methodology and customize it to serve their specific needs. So we work with a lot of investors to accommodate that, tapping into our climate data set and index capabilities. That will conclude my presentation for today. Thank you, Kira.
Thank you so much, Christine, for providing these insights. I would have a follow-up question for you. So how exactly does the index achieve a 1.5 degree temperature alignment?
Yes, so we often get that question, so thanks for that. So the Climate Paris Aligned Index, if you look at the current set of constituents in the portfolio, is basically not made of companies that are 1.5 degree aligned. There are too few of these, in fact, too few of companies with 1.5 degree ambitions. What drives the temperature alignment is really this annual decarbonization of 10% that puts the index on a path to be net zero. And that's really through that mechanism that we achieve these objectives. And the philosophy of the Climate Paris Aligned Index is that to sort of bring the entire economy away from fossil fuel and transition it to a low carbon economy. So that's reflected in the index methodology.
So, Christine, you mentioned that these indexes that you described could also be leveraged for an engagement strategy. Could you maybe provide some more details on this?
Yes, of course. Thanks for that question as well. So I mentioned that earlier, but I can expand on it. So climate indices can be used to support engagement strategies, either in a direct way or what I would say indirectly, but systematic way. So investors can decide to engage directly with companies, and to identify which companies to engage with, they can look at the climate index and decide to engage, for example, with the companies that have the largest underweight versus the traditional market cap index, or that have the highest emissions. But they can also, if they have no resources or means to engage directly with companies, rely on the climate index to do that indirectly, but also systematically, as companies will be rewarded for their progress in the climate transition, and likewise penalized for being a laggard in climate through an underweight. So that reweighting mechanism acts as a way to sort of have an influence on corporates. And the progress of companies is reflected through the periodic index reviews. So companies that progress well on climate will get an uplift in terms of their weight in the index, and vice versa. I hope that clarifies.
Thank you, Christine, for these use cases on how to leverage an index strategy for the net zero approach. With that, I would like to now hand it over to Anya, who will share her insights on how to leverage green opportunities in a net zero portfolio construction.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kira, and welcome to everyone on the line today. So my name is Anja Lutzewald. I also work at MSCI's Climate Risk Center as a climate change specialist consultant. And we just heard from Christine Chardonnay. She talked about the Paris-aligned indexes, and she also mentioned the framework that we have put in place for constructing these Paris-aligned indexes. What I would like to focus on today is really how we can actually leverage that same framework in order to help active investors implement a net zero portfolio strategy. And just to kind of reiterate on these 4 pillars, so it's really very much about minimizing transition and physical risks, optimizing green opportunities, and also ensuring portfolio alignment with the 1-degree pathways. And basically to help investors steer their portfolio construction in line with that framework, we have developed a scenario-specific forward-looking metric, which is called climate value at risk. And this climate value at risk basically quantifies the climate-stressed asset valuation for a broad range of asset classes. So we cover, for example, equities, corporate and sovereign bonds, but also real assets. In the next slide, I'd like to provide a little bit of more background information on how we actually construct this forward-looking metric, climate value at risk. And what you can see here on the left-hand side is in terms of climate modeling that we perform out of the Climate Risk Center in Zurich, we actually employ a hybrid approach. So what we are basically doing is we are marrying top-down with bottom-up data sets here. So it's really a range of climate data sets. We have a range of physical climate models. We also have company-related data. And I just want to give you 2 examples of what we are doing here. So most of you basically know that the Paris Agreement 6 years ago basically came into life based on emission reduction pledges that were made by 190 countries in the world. And what we have basically done here is we have quantified and normalized all of these 190 country level emission reduction pledges, and we have translated that onto the portfolio level. And the way we have achieved that is with the help of an asset location database, which basically links up 500,000 company facilities to about 10,000 companies that we have in the database. And in that way, we can basically capture the potential climate regulation impact that is faced by specific company locations and where they are based. The approach is fully quantifying this. So we are not just quantifying the exposure, but we are actually translating that into future climate-related costs, but also into future green profits that companies could potentially capture based on their innovation potential. And all of that is then plugged into a security valuation framework. So we are always considering the net present value of all of these future climate-related impacts, and then setting that in the context to the current asset valuation. The approach is fully aligned with the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures. So we take into account both transition impacts and also physical impacts based on extreme weather. The focus of today's session is really how investors can basically implement such a net zero portfolio strategy by focusing on climate opportunities. And I want to talk about one very innovative data set that we have developed, which is basically based on patterns. So we have basically ingested a database of 90 million patents, and we have been able to identify low carbon opportunities for 5,000 companies in our database and over 400 groups of low carbon patent technologies. And we basically believe that patents are an important indicator because they deliver deep insights into R&D investments that companies are potentially making. And the chart here on the left-hand side actually illustrates this. So in the gray line actually represents the number of patents in the wind sector that have started growing from the early 2000s. So you can see that, you know, in the early 2000s, the number of wind patents has actually grown quite drastically. And when we then actually look at the addition of wind capacity, we can see that that happened about 7 years later, represented by the blue bars of the chart. So we can see that patents seem to be a leading indicator of identifying low carbon innovation for companies. And we believe that investors can basically capture this patent indicator in order to participate in the opportunity side of the transition. In the next slide, we have actually, we are showing you based on an illustrative portfolio that we have constructed, some of these 400 low carbon patent sectors that I mentioned earlier. So, you know, you can basically identify and invest in companies providing climate solutions based on this patent indicator. And in this way, we can actually help investors achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. And when we look at this chart here in a little bit more detail, then we can see that this hypothetical portfolio actually is capturing specific low carbon aspects. For example, what's interesting here is we also have the IT technology sector where we capture, for example, video conferencing technologies. We can also see that the portfolio has an exposure to alternative energy, for example, wind, photovoltaic, and hydro. But we can also see that it's focusing on the low carbon transport segment with the investment in trains, for example. In the next slide, we are showing you a table with the concrete output that as an investor you would be able to get. So this is kind of, you know, again, a hypothetical peer group of 5 innovative low carbon companies. And what you can see here is not just the total number of patents, but you can also see that we are actually scoring these patents. And based on that score, we are then also calculating a green score. And that green score actually gives an indication of the overall percentage of a company's patent portfolio that is already in the low carbon segment. So this second company, this materials technology company, for example, has a green score of 45.9%. In the third column, you can see that. And that actually shows you that this company has almost half of its patent portfolio already in low carbon. And that actually translates into an overall positive technology opportunity climate VaR of plus 100%. So the scenario indicates that the current valuation of the company might actually double based on the assessment that we are doing here. And in this final slide, we are then presenting the results for this illustrative portfolio that we have put together. And based on the fact that we are heavily overweighting climate solutions based on this low carbon patent indicator, what you can see here is that the technology opportunity result for this portfolio is highly positive at plus 21%. And that compares to just plus 5% for the benchmark. And we can also see that overall the transition risk is actually positive for this climate solution portfolio. So the transition risk is at plus 7.28% versus a negative transition risk for the benchmark at minus 8.27%. And finally, also when we look at the actual temperature distribution, we can also see that this portfolio tilts heavily towards companies with low temperatures. Again, reaffirming that this portfolio is heavily focusing on a 1.5 degree pathway and reaching net zero much quicker. Yeah. back to you again, Kira.
Thank you so much, Anya. As a follow-up question, I would like to ask, since you described, this very interesting illustrative example, how these forward-looking metrics can be leveraged. Is there any use case or, like practical example that you might be able to share with the audience to, see how this actually looks like in practice?
Yeah. In terms of a concrete use case, what we are seeing right now is that a lot of our clients are actually very occupied with the EU's Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, also known as SFDR. And in this regulation, future funds that are launched in compliance with SFDR are basically classified into 3 different categories. And in the most ambitious category, which is Article 9, investment managers basically need to show how a fund is meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. And what we are basically now seeing some of our clients do who are launching such an SFDR Article 9 fund is that they are starting to track a positive climate value at risk, because the idea here is that portfolios with a positive climate VaR are actually contributing to achieving the goals of Paris with relevant low carbon technologies that are helping us to decarbonize the overall economy.
And actually, I would have another question for you. So apart from patents, what other data sets do you assess in order to allow for capturing green opportunities during the portfolio construction?
Yeah, so I mean, patents don't give us the full answer to evaluating low carbon innovation. So indeed, we actually have an additional methodology to assessing a company's low carbon innovation potential. So in addition to the patent scoring, we also rely on the current percentage of a company's clean tech revenues. And in order to assess that, we basically have developed a very granular climate change and natural capital taxonomy, which, by the way, is also going to fully align with the future EU taxonomy. And within climate change, for example, we are looking at different categories. And then these categories are further broken down into 35 subcategories. So it's actually a very granular taxonomy that we are assessing here. So I can just give you one example. For example, in the energy efficiency category, we are assessing, the percentage of revenue that companies have in smart grids, in clean transport infrastructure, or also in energy efficient industrial automation, to name just a few. And the output is always the percentage of clean tech revenues as a percentage of overall company revenues. And that is also fully factored into our climate scenario approach.
An additional question, and I think this is one we hear a lot from clients, would be, how do we address the uncertainty that we see or face with climate scenarios?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, unfortunately, we do not really know the probabilities of climate scenarios, and therefore the associated uncertainty is actually pretty high. The latest TCFD consultation is also referring to that and is actually saying that investors should consider a full range of plausible scenarios in order to address this uncertainty. So what we at MSCI have actually done for our clients is that we not only offer to clients different temperature scenarios. So we have, for example, a 3-degree, a 2-degree, and also a 1.5-degree scenario. But in addition, we also provide a full range of different 2-degree scenarios, as there's basically different ways to actually achieving or to limiting global warming to 2 degrees by the end of the century. And in that way, we are basically allowing investors to showcase the outcomes of these scenarios. We have, for example, in our TCFD report, we have integrated a full range of such climate scenarios.
Thank you, Anya, for providing these interesting insights on how to best capture green technology opportunities in the portfolio construction process. I would now like to hand it over to Jackie to hear from her how engagement can be another key critical component of a net zero strategy implementation.
Okay, thanks so much, Kira. I really appreciate the intro So I'd like to talk a little bit about net zero engagement. And I think that this is definitely one of the most critical tools in which we see investors using in order to achieve net zero portfolios. As we've heard before, currently there are very few investment opportunities that are currently aligned with a net zero pathway. So what we're hearing from the investment industry is that in order to expand the universe of investable companies, in order for investors to meet their own net zero targets, it's necessary to make real world change by putting other companies on this net zero pathway. And so I think this is a big shift in terms of the type of engagement that we've seen from investors in the past. We know that engagement has always been a really core component of being a responsible investor. In fact, active ownership, of course, is one of the principles of the UMPRI. But what makes the net zero engagement use case a little bit different from other engagement use cases is just the fact that there is this very clear end target. So we've seen a rapid evolution in terms of the expectations on investors to decarbonize their portfolios. But here we're really talking about a very specific end goal, which is net zero. We need to stay within this 1.5 degree warming situation in order to limit the most severe effects of climate change and to limit the feedback loops as well. What makes this challenging when we get down to the nuts and bolts of it from an issuer perspective is understanding the trajectory that that particular issuer is on. So while there has been a lot of momentum and a lot of progress made in getting issuers to report on their carbon emissions, in getting them to commit to certain targets, this is now sort of a level up where we need to say, this company actually needs to have an emissions trajectory that is very specifically aligned with a net zero pathway. And how that looks and how that is achieved is going to be quite different depending on which issuer we're talking about, which industry they're in, where they're operating in, and being able to understand what that trajectory looks like is going to be critical for investors in one, choosing their engagement targets, but two, how they also engage with these issuers. So just one example that I'm showing you here on the screen is an example of a car company which is clearly not aligned with a 1.5 degree warming potential. In fact, this company is overshooting its emissions by a significant amount when we sort of look at the carbon budget that it needs to stay within. And so understanding where this company falls as it develops its own transition plans, as it develops its carbon reduction strategy, is going to be really critical in terms of how you as an investor are going to engage with them. Now, what makes this challenging is the fact that the companies all report differently in terms of their decarbonization commitments, in terms of their transition plans. So calculating this overshoot or undershoot of emissions is a little bit challenging to do because, as I mentioned, depending on the industry that the company is operating in, different scopes of emissions are going to be more or less relevant. So understanding if scope 3 is included in the company's carbon footprinting reduction efforts in their transition plan is going to be absolutely critical for some industries and less so for other industries. But it's been very interesting to see how different companies have set their reduction targets, because in some cases it's also for specific business lines or specific products. So how do we normalize this? Because at a portfolio level, it's really challenging to make sense of all of these different targets without really understanding how they are going to help the company, or potentially not, get on that net zero pathway. So one way in which we see investors tracking these targets, tracking the progress over time, is by looking at a number of different indicators. So as I mentioned before, in an ideal world, we would just be able to see companies' alignment with different temperature scenarios and be able to choose the companies that are aligned with a 1.5 degree or below scenario. But there's just really not enough companies in order to do that. So we need to go sort of beyond these warming potential metrics to actually break down the company's targets to understand how comprehensive are they, assuming that one, the issuer has a target in the first place. That's generally the first point of engagement once the carbon footprint or carbon emissions have been reported by that individual issuer. So understanding one, what is that target covering? Is it targeting the relevant scopes that are making up that company's carbon footprint? Again, we see a lot of omission of scope 3, which is why there has been quite a bit of focus on scope 3, particularly for some sectors where scope 3 makes up the majority of companies' carbon footprint. I'm just going to skip this middle section of this scorecard just for a moment to say, there's also a number of metrics that we see being tracked through engagement over time, because that are, I'd say, generally climate management reduction, or sorry, the climate risk management metrics in terms of looking at whether the companies have actually made progress against previous targets. We often see that there are sort of restatements of targets because companies haven't been able to meet them, but also what are the management structures that are in place in terms of how companies plan to get or to achieve this new commitment that they have made. Is it likely based on the strategies that they have in place, or do they intend to rely heavily on carbon offsets so they're not actually reducing their emissions over time? So there's a number of ways in which we see investors wanting to track these metrics. Again, strategy is going to look a little bit different depending on the industry that we're talking about, but there is a lot of opportunity for investors to push issuers to do more in order to actually be able to achieve these reduction goals. Now, coming back to this middle section that I skipped over here, when we start to dig into the targets and dig into the feasibility of them, again, what's different with these net zero targets as opposed to other decarbonization efforts that we've seen in the past is this very specific end goal. So we need to understand, where do these companies' targets actually get the company in the future? What are their projected emissions based on the targets that they have set? Is this aligned or misaligned with a net zero scenario? And this is where it becomes a little bit more complicated, but understanding this overshoot or undershoot is going to be really critical in order for investors to meet their own net zero commitments as well. And just to show you a little bit about what this looks like if we compare two different companies and two different targets that have been set by companies in the same sector, what we will see is on one case, we do have an instance of Shell who has set a target for scopes 1, 2, and 3. We do see that the company is very much aligned with a net zero trajectory based on the carbon emissions reduction that are projected out to the end of the century, versus its peer ExxonMobil, whose target actually covers about 16% of the company's emissions. So when we look at the company's overall projected emissions, including scope 1, 2, and 3, even taking into account the company's target, we see that it is very misaligned with the carbon emissions intensity that it would need in order to get to that net zero pathway. So we're looking at two very different situations of companies that are actually within the same industry. You can even see from the strategy component here, they even are relying on some of the same technologies. But the way in which investors would engage with these two companies is going to be quite different. One, of course, ExxonMobil would need to incorporate some additional scopes, particularly scope 3, into its own targets in order to become more aligned with that net zero pathway. Whereas Shell, what we see is from a transition perspective, it is already on the right trajectory. But what's been interesting just to see, in recent developments, how this has played out is that as we talk about transition and physical risk for companies for issuers in our universe, there are also these additional regulatory and litigation risks as well. And what we recently saw in the case of Shell is a recent court decision saying that the company's emissions reduction target actually is still not stringent enough. And so they were actually mandated to reduce emissions by even more. So, just having this alignment with a net zero pathway does not necessarily mean that the company is clear of or is not necessarily going to be affected by transition risk. There still can be some additional elements that are going to be critical. So again, the need to understand the scope, the likelihood, the scope of the target, the likelihood of meeting the target, but also the other related risks that the companies might face is really critical and offers different points for engagement from the investment community. Now, we've talked a little bit about these different metrics in terms of the scope, in terms of the strategy, in terms of alignment with different temperature scenarios. I would also just mention that one of the metrics that we start to see becoming of much more interest to the investment community, it's actually currently out for consultation as part of the current TCFD consultation, is this implied temperature rise metric, which is also getting a lot of attention from the regulators. What we're looking at with implied temperature rise, as opposed to, say, a warming potential metric, which would project a company's emissions out to a certain point in the future, implied temperature rise is really looking at the company's absolute emissions through the end of the century to see over time how much a company would be contributing to climate change, particularly if we did consider this in the context of the carbon budget for that particular industry. So this is really where a lot of the climate science comes into play, understanding the trajectory that the overall economy is on and where that issuer sort of sits within that global economy. It's a really easy, I don't say easy way to, but it's an important metric in order to track temperature alignment, while also understanding the role that issuer plays sort of within the broader economy. And it again offers another point or another metric that can be used for ongoing engagement with companies. So this is another sort of emerging model that we start to see becoming more and more adopted by investors, as TCFD is recommending this, as well as some other regulators. So I will just end my portion there, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
So Jackie, I would have a question for you. We've seen collective engagement become a very powerful tool to drive companies' target setting. But from your perspective and also your engagement with clients, what do you think is driving that momentum?
Yeah, great question. I think what we're starting to see is that, from the corporate perspective, there is a lot of maybe confusion around where they need to go in terms of reporting, in terms of target setting. In the past, they've been met with a number of different demands from different investors. And so what we've started to see is that as a way to push this momentum forward in order to actually create real action in the corporate space, investors realize that it makes sense to collaborate. It makes sense to come together to ask for the same thing. It's much more powerful when you have 100 investors come together as a group to request, the same disclosure, the same targets, so that corporates understand that this is really where the economy is headed. It's not just the interest of one investor. It's not just a small fraction of their shareholders that are asking for this, but you have a lot more power when you have multiple shareholders backing one resolution or involved in a particular engagement that are asking for the same thing. And I think this is where we've started to see the investor community become a lot more sophisticated in recent years, particularly as we have seen this coalescence around this net zero target. Before, we were just talking about portfolio decarbonization. Now that investors are starting to set their own targets, they realize that their voice is much more powerful as part of a collective. And so I think this is really one of the main reasons we're starting to see more interest in collective engagement, but also just to clarify things for the corporates as well.
thank you for sharing your perspective. And now you also mentioned the importance of reporting, but oftentimes we actually see that the reporting on emissions data, for example, doesn't cover all scopes, so 1, 2, and 3, or neither all categories of scope 3. So how can we then help investors assess the full carbon footprint of their portfolios to also ensure that all scopes are covered when it comes to better understand the target setting of their portfolio companies?
Yeah, the coverage of emissions is a really critical part of this puzzle that is missing. And I think we've definitely seen much more momentum again as part of these collective engagement efforts to get companies to report on scope 3. But as you mentioned, it's very patchy. So even for companies that do report on scope 3, they may not report on all relevant scopes that are all relevant categories, I should say, that are relevant to their business. So what we've done actually is come up with estimations for each individual category of scope 3 that can be applied consistently to a broad universe of companies, because even for those that do report some scope 3 emissions, we have noticed that most of the critical categories, or the largest percentage of their carbon footprint, tend to be missing. So just as an example of this, I used to be a consumer sector analyst, and we used to see that in the food sector, a lot of food companies wouldn't actually report on their emissions from agriculture, which could be 90% plus of their overall carbon footprint. So having a robust emissions estimation framework is really critical for scope 3. Estimations are estimations. They're not going to be perfect, but they do, one, incentivize companies to start reporting more accurately on scope 3, but two, do allow for that broader coverage, both for portfolio carbon footprinting as well as for target setting. One thing that we saw in some of the examples I presented is that some of these seemingly ambitious targets are actually not very ambitious at all if they don't include those categories of scope 3 that are most relevant for particular industries. So I think the importance of that emissions estimation framework is quite critical. And this is one thing that we have done at MSCI.
Thanks so much, Jackie. And yeah, very interesting to hear your thoughts on target setting and the importance of scope 3 estimations and reporting. So unfortunately, we've reached the end of today's session, and I would like to thank once more our 3 speakers, Christine, Anya, and Jackie, for their contributions. I think a key takeaway from today can be that there is not one ultimate net zero approach. It is indeed a journey which can take very different strategic directions. And hopefully you have found insights today shared by our speakers that are useful to your own net zero strategy implementation. Please do reach out directly in case of any further questions, and we'll make sure to get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you for attending today's webinar.